Hi, it's Susan, and welcome to this video. You're currently watching a time-lapse version of this stormy cloud sky painting, and later on in this video, I'll be taking you along for the guided real-time version of the painting, if that's something that you're interested in watching. So the painting you are seeing here is actually one that I painted about a year ago as an exercise inside of my watercolor painting community called Paint With Me. Last August, our topic of the month was skies, and what you're seeing here was one of those exercises. I was actually sort of hesitant to share this video here today because through my present day eyes, I see so many things that I would have done differently along with all the flaws that are in the painting. The voice of my inner critic can be quite loud, as I'm sure you're familiar with, since you've probably heard the same voice in your head at one point or another. But there were multiple reasons I decided to share the video in spite of my self-doubt and self-criticism. And the first is that while I believe that time-lapse paintings can be helpful in seeing how another person chose to approach a painting, it can cause an unrealistic perception of what actually went into the painting. For example, how long it actually took to complete the painting and parts that might have been tricky for the painter or areas in which a mistake was made. These things tend to get covered up and smoothed over by a time lapse. Second, I strongly believe that even though I look back on my own painting process here and see many things I would do differently, the approach is still valid in its own way. It's a marker in time for where I was on my journey at that specific moment. And what I shared in this video is one way of approaching the subject. In fact, it may be just the approach you need at this point on your journey. So I guess I'm sharing this in hopes that it meets you where you're at with what you need to know right now. I saw a quote a while back that sums up what I'm trying to say here by James Clear, and it goes, "It's almost always better to learn from peers who are 2 years ahead of you than mentors who are 20 years ahead of you. Life evolves and most insights get outdated." So with that, what you'll see next is an actual excerpt from a painting exercise that I shared inside of the Paint With Me community in August of 2020. I suppose you could call this a peek inside at just one of the ways we practice and learn together inside the group. And of course, if you want to join us inside and learn and explore alongside myself and a supportive group of friends, we would love to have you. I left the link in the description box below the video if you want to find out more. All right, so here's the video. I hope you find it helpful and learn something from it today. So let's get started. And basically in this one, I am dividing the painting into two parts. So there's above the horizon line and then below the horizon line. And so again, I am picking this picture because the focus and the emphasis is on the sky, since that's what we're working on specifically in this month's content. And there is very little emphasis on the lower portion, the foreground, and things like that, but that's only because we need it for context. And like I said, context helps these skies really feel like skies. So we need them for context, but we don't want to concentrate a lot of our energy on those areas, at least for these studies. And so I started by wetting the top half just with clean water, and you can see that the water-soluble pencil is still there but hasn't completely been washed away, and that's great because I wanted a little bit of guideline, but I didn't want to have the pencil lines show through the paint when I'm done. And so I think this is a really good middle ground. But I wanted you to also just see how it works and how water-soluble pencil reacts when you use it with a watercolor painting. So hopefully that is helpful. So now moving on to the actual painting. In this one, because there's such a large clump of clouds to the right-hand side, I'm sort of painting around it even though I wet the entire sheet of paper. The background gradient sky is very light, and I would say pretty subtle. So the change from the dark area down to the lighter area at the bottom is not very, very drastic. So I'm keeping everything pretty subtle, and again, being careful about working quickly while the paint is wet. So as you know, probably know by now, when you're working wet on wet, timing is very crucial, and you want your paper to stay damp while you're trying to do a smooth gradient sky. And so you have to work quite quickly in order to get these soft edges and smooth transitions. And so I think it's really helpful in these cases to use gravity as your friend. So you can see I had tilted the paper when I was doing the blue sky, and now that I've turned it around upside down, I'm adding the warm parts that you see in the bottom of the reference photo to the horizon line, and then I'm also using gravity to help me bring that paint down and blend with the blue. So that is just a tip that I have, and something that you might not see on watercolor videos normally, just because tilting the paper like this really doesn't let the viewer see what's going on, but it's an actual thing that I think helps and happens behind the scenes, especially for me a lot. So once you lay the paper down, your paint will stop moving around on the paper. So once it has sort of brought your colors down to where you want them to, or it's done what you want to do, you can always lay the board flat, and then your paint will stop moving around. If you're using a lot of water, so if you're painting super wet, you're going to get sometimes like very fast movement down the page, like drip marks. Sometimes you'll even get a bead of water, and that's fine. You know, it just means that you have a pretty damp surface. So just watch the angle that you're moving your board at, and make sure to lay it flat if it's running too wild or too fast. So for me, my dampness is sort of just at the right point where it's not running in a crazy way, but it is still allowing the colors to bleed and move around on the paper. So now I have the panel flat, and I'm looking at the reference photo, and I'm looking at the warm area. So I'm trying to pick out, where does it look like there are warmer tones in the sky, so that I can come in and put almost like an underlayer. So if you remember with layering, we create sort of this underlayer of lighter, warmer tones, and then we can come back over the top of it. So while I'm not actually doing layering, so to say, right now, I'm thinking about it in that way. So how do I apply the lightest layers, create that warm undertone for the clouds that are showing up, so that it is the base for the other colors that I'm going to layer on top of it. So with watercolors, I know you hear this a lot, working from light to dark, and this is a really good example where that works really well. So working from light to dark, it means that you're looking at your reference photo and you're trying to see through what's there. And it's really easy to look at a reference photo and you look at the dark parts first and want to paint them first. But here, you're trying to see through the dark parts, look at where there's light parts, and you're painting those kind of first as an underlayer. And sometimes it means exaggerating what you see, and it also means ignoring sort of the boundaries of what you're looking at. So for example, if you see a light area but it shows up as a sliver of warm area, you can be unafraid to paint beyond that sliver. So you can allow the paint to spread out, so you can get a bigger area of warmth, if that makes sense, because you know you're going to come over it with dark. So that's where layering dark over light in watercolors is really powerful, because if you come in with your light layer first, you don't really have to worry as much about how far it bleeds or it overtaking more of the area than you meant it to, because you almost want it to do that in a way, because it's just a background and you know that you can kind of come over the top of it and add in those shadows. And I have to say that for me at this point, when I started putting in the dark shadows of the clouds, I noticed that the paint was a little bit too wet. It's spreading a little bit more than I'd like it to. So I backed off a bit and moved down to other areas of the painting to allow that first part to dry just a little bit longer. Now that sort of constant adjustment and just reacting to this current state of your painting is important, right? And there's nothing wrong with putting down the strokes and then realizing, oh, I went in a little bit too early, and then backing off and saying, you know what, let me do something else and then I'll come back. And so for me, doing these clouds, I actually realized, you can see at this point, that I started to try and lift sort of the wider areas, and I didn't come in early enough. So the paint basically dried a little bit more than I would have liked it to. And I wanted to be able to lift more color, but I also realized, the background's pretty light, and maybe I have the opportunity later to darken the top of it and use a little bit more negative painting to carve out those shapes. So, I remember thinking at this point that, I kind of made a mistake, but it's okay, and I can try and fix it later or make it look a little bit different. And so I wasn't too worried. I just kept going. And now I'm just kind of cleaning up a little bit of that shadow area. As you can see, I said previously, it bleeds a little bit more, right? It bled more than I wanted it to. So I was able to take a damp brush and then come back and sort of clean up that top edge where it was running away a little bit. So I'm just being careful. The balance of overworking and not overworking, it's always going to be there. And the more you paint, the more you start to get a sense of, oh, I might be overworking this part. And it's really easy to just keep trying to tinker with it. I have that tendency to do that. And the harder thing sometimes is to pause and take a moment to reassess what's going on, and even to have the courage to stop painting altogether and know that you have the chance to, if you want, in some cases it works really well, right? To come back and do another layer over what you've done, approach it again in a sense. But like I was saying before, my painting was starting to dry, so it was okay for me to keep trying to sort of work on these negative paintings, because at this point, I'm trying to describe to you what it feels like, right? When you're doing this wet on wet, your paper is starting to dry, but you can still add a little bit to it and blend out those edges and not overwork it, right? You just sort of have a sense. Just trust your own instincts and you'll know. And your instincts will tell you, oh, this isn't a good time to keep going. Or if you don't have those instincts built just yet, keep going and allow yourself to learn the lessons so that the next time you paint, you can back off when you know, because you've gone far enough to learn the lesson, so that next time when you start feeling that happening, you'll know to back off. So in my case, I used a little bit of negative painting, as you saw with those lower white clouds. I added a little bit of blue to paint around, and then I did a little bit of lifting, and that really helped define this lower middle white cloud. And then, as you know, adding value and contrast changes is really going to make things pop. And so this is where adding these details that are along the horizon line, the darker clouds, and those shadows at the bottom of this white cloud, those are really going to help the rest of the sky pop. And so working on these using techniques like softening edges, I was going to say edge softening, which is also a way you could describe it. And I have to say, as I'm saying that, I'm not actually sure if softening edges is an actual name of a technique. And I am just sharing that with you as a technique because it's something I recognize that I do. And so I might have just made up that name, but if it helps you understand what I'm doing, then I'm glad. And the purpose is for you to recognize a technique that you can use and to use it to your advantage as you're painting. So right now, that's what I'm doing. So I put down some dark colors and I'm leaving some of the edges hard, and in other places, I'm softening the edges. And when you dilute and soften edges, you have this opportunity, as I mentioned in the exercises, to pull shadows in. So you're almost creating shadows and creating a diluted color of paint by using the existing paint that's already down on your paper. So you're pushing paint around to create and carve out shadows, as long as you are working at a point where your paper is not so wet that all of your paint is running away. So at this point, when you can see it, the paper is not dry, but it is still a little bit damp, and it's allowing the shape of the paint that I'm putting down to bleed and soften a bit along the edges, but it's still it's holding its dimensions, right? It's holding its strokes. And so at this point is a really good time that you can work with softening edges and being careful about not introducing too much water, because again, we're going to watch out for those backruns unless those backruns are what you want. Backruns in skies sometimes can be really beautiful if that's the style you're looking for. And if you want to give it a try, you could actually do some tests and some exercises where you allow backgrounds to happen in your sky. I think they look really good for tumultuous skies, like really ominous, stormy skies. This one's sort of a subtle, I feel like, storm cloud sky, so we're not really going to use that technique here. This is more of a softer look. And so again, I'm continuing to add those shadows here using a darker value to really carve out the lighter values by painting around it. So, I call this sort of like negative painting. So you're painting around the object you want to pop out, and you're relying on value change to define the shapes. And so here again, it's a really good opportunity to create hard edges, but also you can use that edge softening edge technique to make it less harsh. And I think there's a lot of little finessing that happens here, but you can see that I'm not pushing or scrubbing too much at the paper. I'm being pretty light-handed, and that's something that maybe is helpful to remember. So again, back to this top area that I mentioned before, I knew I could come back here and sort of do some carving out using negative painting by darkening the area above it. If you look at the reference photo, this isn't necessarily accurate, right, to what is in the reference photo, but I'm taking a hint from the reference photo. There's a patch of like little broken up clouds at the top of the photo. So adding a little bit of darkness here, using a little bit of dry brush technique, I think it just helps define that top cloud. It creates a little bit of a border for it. And so that's what I was going for. So now at this point, I am adding sort of mid-tone shadows and responding to the colors that are in the reference photo. So this patch of clouds is really interesting because it feels, if you look at it, sort of as an overall picture, you just glance at the reference photo, it just seems like there's a pretty big patch of dark clouds there. But when you look closer, there's different tones in these clouds. There's grays, there's browns, sort of like a dark brown, or I think I called it a greenish gray. I mean, I only say green because we're mixing sort of a yellow color with a blue color and a little bit of gray, so it turns a little, it's more olive is the color, but it's like sort of a brown, like an earthy color. And I think there's a lot of dimension to be had in using these colors in the sky. I kind of love this palette, and I would love to personally explore more skies with these colors in it eventually, and maybe they'll just show up in my landscape paintings in the future. But I think that you can start to see here how abstract these clouds are. So I had said this before, that without context, these skies can look quite, I'm going to use the word blobby or indistinguishable. You can't really look at them. You don't look at this and you don't think automatically realistic clouds. Perhaps because I told you it was a sky, that you can look at it and say, yeah, it does look sort of like clouds. But I want you to maybe take yourself away from the situation and think to yourself, if I just looked at this and nobody told me what it was supposed to be, would this look like clouds? And I think the answer is no. I feel like you would maybe guess that they were clouds, but it's not 100% sure, like, yes, this is a painting of a sky. I feel like it would be a question answer. Like, I think this is a sky, or maybe it's a sky, or is it a sky? And I want you to recognize that without context, these loose skies tend to look really abstract, and it's something to appreciate about them. And it's also something that we have to learn to let go, in a sense. Before I add in this ocean, It does. To be honest with you, and that's just the way I see it, it looks very, very abstract. And it isn't until I start to add in the horizon with the ocean line and the waves that it starts to be, to give it context, right? So this ocean wave, I want to say, is really fun. It's a really fun way to paint ocean waves because the ones in this picture are very choppy. There's a lot of movement in the water, and so I just took creative liberty, and I used dry brush effect to create those the sparkles in the water or the roughness in the water, and this is an interpretation of what's going on. Right? I'm not painting exactly what's there. This is a true example of sort of just capturing the essence of what's going on in the photograph. And I love using dry brush effect when I can, and I love using motion of brush strokes when I can. So you can see that these brush strokes I'm making are very they're like flicks, and then I sort of let the brush strokes stand as they fall. I'm not smoothing them out. I'm brushing in the direction that I feel that the waves are moving, and then I am standing back and leaving them alone for the most part. So that's something that I really love doing with my paintings, and I think that it's something that watercolor allows us to do beautifully. You can do this with acrylics and oils too, and I think that's what's so beautiful about those mediums is that you can see the movement of brushstrokes in the paint. And with watercolors, we can achieve this, the same feeling. And I like to try and use that to its advantage if I can. All right, so now that the sky is a little bit more dry, I can come back and add and work in a few more details. And the details are, the most successful when it's a combination, I think, of dry brush and softening of the edges. And at this point, at this pass, it's time for me, at least, to look at where it needs to be darkened, maybe where more details need to be added, maybe where there's harsh lines that I want to pick up. And so these are sort of final touches that are happening at this point. Okay, so you're watching me now do my final little adjustments here. I think, it's funny because I always say that there's a little voice in our heads that will tell us when we are ready to stop. It sort of whispers and says, I think it's good enough. And we don't always listen to it. And I think I think that it was starting to tell me that it was almost time, but I was still unwilling to put down the brush. And so I just want to let you into my head a little bit. And that's what was going on, and that's what is going on at this point. But I did catch that towards the horizon line, there was a little bit more definition of blues and a little bit more texture down there. So I thought it could use just one more pass. And so I'm going to darken the area near the horizon. It has this movement to it. And honestly, I think if I was painting at a bigger scale, I would spend obviously more time on these details. But at this scale, it's pretty small. And so I just keep it pretty loose and abstract. So there was just a few brush strokes, and I thought, you know what, that's good enough. Let's step back and take a look at what this painting needs before we stop. And I decided, looking at the value of the water, and so hopefully you can see that there's a pretty big value contrast between the horizon line, so just above it, and the start of the water, which is nice. It's nice and crisp, but I felt like the left side, and especially the clouds right above the water on the left side, were dark and had some nice definition, and I needed to balance it out on the right, because if you look at the reference photo, there's a pretty dark patch, right? The clouds on the right are pretty dark, and so it needed to be darkened just a bit for value so that it could feel a little balanced. And you can see that this technique at this point I would call layering, because the clouds are already dry, and I actually went back in and I wet the surface again with a little bit of clean water, and now I'm just introducing more darker brush strokes. So this is layering in action. I'm just layering over the existing sky, and this is a really good way to not fix but add to drawings without overworking them or without the as much danger of overworking them. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, and I want to point it out again. And that is that when we're painting with skies, it's really easy to overwork if we are constantly moving the brush around on wet areas. So we're pushing the paint around, we're not letting it dry, and we're continuing to push the paint around and add paint, take away paint, add color, etc. That is when we're going to start overworking. And I would say, actually, standing back, there's a little bit of overworking going on in this patch of clouds. I don't think it's quite as successful as it could have been. But that being said, I want you to remember that layering is a really good way to not overwork your sky, yet continue to add details to it. Hopefully that makes sense as you're watching me paint. And let me know if it doesn't in the comments, and I'll make sure to try and clarify for you. All right, so that little voice definitely was telling me to stop. I don't know why. I always choose to do just one more dab or touch. I don't know what that is about human nature, but it definitely always happens. I hope that watching me paint this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions, and I cannot wait to see how yours turn out.